Hello, can you hear me okay? Great. My name is Hannah. I'm a principal content designer at Nomensa. And the image on this slide, whoa, my face is very big there, shows me a white woman with red hair at the top of Brandon Hill in Bristol. I've been with Nomensa for just over a year, mostly working on public sector projects. But prior to that, I mostly worked in the women's not-for-profit sector, so I've worked for Women's Aid, the Fawcett Society, and was stolen from Girl Guiding. I actually started my career in book publishing, where I once wiped the sweat off Kerry Katona's brow, so that was the career highlight, and I'm not really sure where to go from there. This talk was actually designed with my colleague, Lauren Ellis, who's another principal content designer at Nomensa, but she couldn't make it today, but I just wanted to acknowledge that a lot of her work has gone into this as well. And it's not just for content designers. Hopefully, there will be things in here that can help you with all sorts of writing in your work. So inclusive language is ever evolving, which is amazing and wonderful and really exciting, but it can feel quite challenging to keep up. So I'm hoping what I can do today is help you with a few tips to help you on your way. And you might be asking, what is this white, non-disabled, middle-class woman got to say about inclusion? I do have a little bit of lived experience. If you couldn't tell from the ridiculous haircut and the sweater vest, I am part of the queer community. My partner is neurodivergent and disabled, but more importantly, you don't need a list of marginalised qualities to be practicing and learning about this work. We all need to be doing it. I have worked across the public, private, and charity sectors, so I'd like you to think of this presentation as kind of a few tips and lessons and things I've learned along the way. And I'd really like it to be an open dialogue, so please feel free to challenge me very kindly and ask questions and speak out. So what am I going to talk about today? I'm going to start with talking about the difference between accessibility and inclusion. I think we sometimes use those words interchangeably, but they're quite different things. We're going to take a look at ourselves and our team. We're going to take a look at our users. And then we're going to move on to kind of approaches you can take with writing content and some practical tips. So, the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines are a really amazing foundation for creating websites that are accessible for disabled people. But they're not always inclusive, and that's down to the kind of content and the language that you're using. For example, a music venue's website could be technically accessible, but if it doesn't tell you if it's got wheelchair access, then it's not inclusive. By writing in an inclusive way, we can help not just more users, but more user needs. And this is because we're thinking about things like age, race, location, economic status, language, literacy, and if we're really doing it well, we can also think about users' differing emotional states as well. So just as accessible design doesn't have to limit you creatively, neither does inclusive writing. They don't have to be guardrails that you push against. Inclusive writing isn't just the right thing to do, it can also be a really fun, creative challenge. So just to sum up, accessible generally means usable, inclusive means designing for as many people as possible. To put it another way, they should be working hand in hand, but inclusion is bringing everyone along. So, I'm just going to talk a little bit, and I'm really sorry if you know what I'm about to say. If you do, you can just sit back and feel smug for the next few minutes. But I'm just going to talk a little bit about the distinctions we're making here and who we're talking about when we're talking about inclusion. Protected characteristics is probably something you've heard of, and they're listed on the slide here. We've got age, race, sex, gender reassignment, pregnancy, disability, religion or belief, and sexual orientation. And having one of these protected characteristics can make you part of what we call a marginalised group. If you have one of these characteristics, then you are, in theory, protected by the law. For example, if you are a gay couple and you get refused a double room at a hotel, you could take legal action against that hotel. And there's lots of types of discrimination. It's very real, from workplace discrimination to hate crimes, and it happens to people every day. It's also not just about each of these characteristics alone, because they often intersect with each other. And acknowledging that intersecting characteristics can bring unique challenges is called intersectionality. For example, a black woman experiences unique challenges that a white woman or a man of colour does not. So yeah, what we're talking about today is more to do with marginalisation and social exclusion. So having one of those characteristics can put you in one of these, what we call marginalised groups. You also might be marginalised without having one of these characteristics. For example, if you're of a low socioeconomic status or you have a bigger body size. And there are lots of ways that people experience marginalisation in their day-to-day lives that doesn't equate to what the law sees as discrimination. Think of it as having your needs pushed to one side or living in a world that simply isn't designed for you. A very clear example of this is something called the white default, and it's been quite common. Things that have been designed with and for only white people in mind. There's been stories of electronic soap dispensers that won't dispense soap for black skin, for example, and plasters have been in light skin tones for decades. Examples of being marginalised without having one of these characteristics could be going to shops and they only accept card payments, but you have a cash-in-hand job, or clothes retailers not stocking your size, or only being able to access services online. So if you had to go to the library every time you needed to do a bank transaction, for example, I think your life would become a little bit more challenging. Some examples from the digital sphere. I did a search on a makeup retailer's website for foundation, and I'd say about 80% of the results on the search page were images of white skin and white skin tones. You might have seen some stories last year about police facial recognition AI not being able to tell black faces apart, which was leading to some people being arrested for crimes that they didn't commit. And there's also been examples of this in things like Zoom technology, with black faces fading into Zoom backgrounds because the algorithm can't detect black skin as well. Gender questions on forms often only have two options, which isn't very inclusive. This was from a cinema loyalty scheme. And similarly on forms, people being told that their name's invalid and getting that wiggly autocorrect line all along it. And you might have seen a campaign last year called I'm Not a Typo, which was to address that problem of people whose names, largely of Asian and African descent, were getting the wiggly autocorrect line. They then have to go into their dictionary and add their own name to their dictionary, which is an example of digital assimilation and a step that many white people don't have to take. So you might not be discriminating, but you could be marginalising. Marginalised people face all sorts of barriers in their life that can disempower them. Inclusion goes beyond not just discriminating and actively seeks to include people. So now we're going to take a little look of ourselves, which is always a bit scary, but bear with me. Think about the language that you use in your everyday life. There are lots of common and ableist, racist phrases that we use in everyday life that can seem very far from their original context and meaning. Some examples that I hear regularly are Chinese whispers, which stems from a racist idea in the 1800s that Chinese people were deliberately speaking in a way that was unintelligible. Similarly, long time no see and no can do have origins in the mocking of Chinese immigrants using pidgin English. And these terms can be debated in their offensiveness. I'm not Chinese, I can't tell you if they are, but it's worth checking in with yourself and seeing what you're comfortable using. Some other examples I've seen are asking what's your spirit animal on a popular dating app as a conversation starter, which really trivialises an important part of Indigenous culture. Other examples are using gender terms, so walking in the room saying, "Hey guys," lots of people don't mind, but that can be ruining someone's day. Mental health language, I'm not going to repeat the terms here, but I think you probably know the kinds of words that I mean. calling someone a name that's like actually a serious medical condition is not really okay. And some examples that I've used unknowingly recently, I recently called something lame and my partner had to call me out and tell me it was ableist. I said to a colleague just a couple of weeks ago that I said something was falling on deaf ears, and actually there are way better ways to express myself. So the point of telling you that is everyone does it and it happens to everyone, and I say things like that all the time and I'm still allowed to be on a stage talking about inclusion. So don't beat yourself up about it, just learn from it and move on. The second thing to think about is your team. When we're thinking about those examples I was talking about, it can feel like there's been a big omission in the design process, and often that can come down to who's in the room and who's making the decisions. We're all unconsciously biased. We all tend to hone in on our own needs and our own wants, and we can forget to think about the people that are different to us. And representation isn't going to fix everything. Marginalisation is obviously a huge, complex problem, but having more representation in the room undoubtedly leads to products being designed for more people. And we know that people hiring often do so in their own image. So think about what you can do to buck this trend. And I don't have time to do that in this presentation, but there's a lot of resources online that can help you think about how to make your hiring practices more inclusive. And make sure it's not tokenistic. If you're inviting those people into the room, then you have to listen to their voices. Maybe you know that your team isn't diverse, but you're not hiring at the moment, that's not an option, in which case you're going to have to go a bit further to think about who's not in the room, and we'll come on to that a bit later. I'm just going to read out this quote from Candy Williams, who's the head of content at Bumble at the moment, my personal content hero, and she says, "If there was ever an industry where we need inclusive teams, it's in user experience. We have a responsibility for designing products and services that people from all walks of life rely on. How can we do that if our own teams and the people we research aren't representative?" Now we're going to take a little look at our users and our participants. I think I'm actually really going to blow some minds here, but the best way to make sure you're creating inclusive experience is by testing them. Groundbreaking, I know, but using research and testing on your design projects, internal processes or services is the best way to make sure that they're inclusive. Research reveals what your users really need. It can show you who they are and how they identify. Your users can guide how they want to be referred to and spoken about, what's important to them, and the difference a product or service makes to them. This means we can craft our language and prioritize content around that too. And we can also look at how they want to access a service. They can decide whether it's paper-based processes, speaking to a person, or doing things online. And it should show you unseen or unknown challenges that your users face. Like, we don't know what we don't know, and that's why we do research. So missing out certain groups can mean you're missing out really important parts of the design process. I did some very poor practice, unscientific research, so if you are a researcher, please don't throw things at me. But I run a queer hiking group in Bristol called Queer Hiking Bristol. We have about 2,000 followers on our Instagram, and my personal Instagram has about 700. And I asked both followings, when picking where to go on holiday abroad, what's the first thing that you do? I wonder if I know some Nomensans know this already, so you're not allowed to answer, but can anyone guess what half of the LGBTQ+ community, the Queer Hiking Bristol community, said? Yes, very, very close. About half said they check the safety of the destination for how safe it is for queer people to go there. And the image on this slide shows the answers from the queer hiking respondents. Laws vary across countries, but there's around 64 in the world at the moment that still criminalise homosexuality, and they can come with a hefty prison sentence or even the death penalty, and they include popular holiday destinations like the Maldives, Morocco, Sri Lanka, Malaysia. And obviously, just because a country has decriminalised homosexuality, it doesn't mean that it's widely understood or accepted. So that can leave queer people at risk of insecurity when going on holiday. In comparison, 0 out of 7 straight people mention personal safety. And the images on this slide also show those responses. And I'd make a guess that people of colour, women travelling alone, disabled folk would all research the country they were going to for their own access needs beforehand. And this is just an example of how diverse research can help you think about things you might not think about otherwise. And the extra steps that marginalised people sometimes have to take for seemingly quite simple tasks. For example, this could possibly help you with the UX of a travel website or a service you're working on. And Airbnb, in fact, actually already let you put a sticker as a host to say that you're queer friendly. And believe it or not, it does make you feel a little bit safer. Just some general tips on research. Always research with as wide a range of, I keep tripping over this wire, I'm sorry. Always research with as wide a range of participants as you can, whatever you're researching. It doesn't have to be specific to a marginalised group. That is good practice across the board. And it's not enough just to get those participants in your sessions. You need to consider inclusive research methods and practice. Again, there's lots of resources online. GovUK has got some great resources on how to practice research inclusively. If you know that you're missing people, you can be very specific when asking for diversity in your pool. So talk to your recruiters about what you really need. And I know that this can be very challenging sometimes. Often we have a very small pool, or we're working with a very niche product or service, but really push for it where you can. And this is especially important, as I mentioned before, if the team itself working on the product is not diverse. And if you are using specific marginalised groups for your research because they're marginalised, you should always aim to compensate them for their time. Asking people to talk about often painful lived experience for free isn't really great practice. But what can you do if you don't have any research budget? Maybe you don't have budget, maybe you don't have time, resources, or maybe your senior stakeholders don't think it's important. There are a few things that you can look at that might help. So you can speak to experts and activists. It's okay not to know. There's people out there whose whole job it is to know these things, and you can definitely reach out to them. Charities are a really great place to start. Stonewall for LGBTQ+ stuff, Scope for Disability, Age UK, and there's many more that can help you. And they often already have resources online that you can look at. Use online tools like SEMrush or Google Analytics, and these can show you what search terms people are using and challenges they might be facing or anxieties they might be feeling. And really crucially, these will be in their own words, which can be really helpful for your research. This is good practice anyway for lots of products and services, but ask for feedback. You might not get anything, but you might, and especially if something is missing or not quite right, people are more likely to get in touch and tell you what you're doing wrong. And it could be as simple as a form or a component, or even just an email address on a web page. Use free text fields. Again, this is really good practice anyway, but it can also help you gather information about the terms that people are using for themselves. It can give you really good insights into their expressions, and you can analyse, group, and use them to improve your products going forward. I'm going to talk a little bit about approach now. Inclusive content starts with the words, but it's much more than just copy. It's about a way of designing and thinking. And we've talked about how research should inform your writing, but we're going to talk a little bit more about how to make decisions and what language you can use going forward. Ultimately, we're conduits for our users, and we need to be writing with them and not for them. But how do we do that? Well, researching often, number one, and gathering feedback. You can reach out to contacts within your sector. For example, last year, Nomensa worked with a service that helps witnesses and victims of crime understand the court process, and they had a charity partner that they put us in touch with, so we could use some of their service users for user interviews, which was really valuable. You can also use tactics like pair writing, where you sit down and write with someone else. And we often think about, we often do this with experts, subject matter experts, and we always think of them as being experts in their field, but actually it can be service users themselves. I did this at Women's Aid when I was working on a young women's service. I had a group of young survivors, and we sat down and wrote a bunch of stuff together, and it meant that the end product had words that resonated with people who'd been through the same thing at a similar age. And the women themselves got a lot out of it and felt like they were really giving something back. And this will also help ensure your content is reflective of your users' lived experience. Writing alongside them helps them tell their own stories. And it tells you what they actually need from content, as well as how they want to be referred to. There's variations and nuances with any user group, and a term might be the right thing or feel fitting for some, but it may feel alien and wrong to others, and some people might not care at all. That's natural, and people are different, and so are their identities. Working alongside the people who use your product or service means you can accurately reflect what they need. For example, again, when I worked at Women's Aid, we did a round of research where we discovered that actually women weren't really resonating with the term survivor, and Women's Aid language had moved along from using victim a few years before I started, so we're talking 8 or 9 years ago now, to use the more empowering survivor. But actually, it turned out when we spoke to these women that they didn't think of themselves in that way, and that the abuse was just something that had happened to them, and it wasn't a core part of their identity. So Women's Aid were then able to go and use that insight to think about the language they were using on their website and what people were searching for. So I'm going to talk about some practical tips here. I've got 10 tips, so I haven't been able to cover everything, but these should be some best practice things to get you started, and I'm really hoping that you could use them in any kinds of writing in your work. So it's not just for content designers. You can apply these practices to emails, discussion guides, or even Teams messages. The first thing to think about is pay attention to what your language normalizes. There's a subtle, and sometimes not so subtle, power in the language you use. The words we use can really reinforce power or societal norms, and examining it helps us prioritize people over systems. Think about all those terms and words I was using earlier. Avoid using language that makes assumptions about people. Think about the accidental androcentric language we use in everyday life, so things like man-made, manpower. And it's okay to be ambiguous if you're going to reach a more broad audience. So you can use things like partner or spouse rather than husband or wife, or parent rather than mother or father. And in a web environment, if you're talking about people, it's better to use they or them rather than he or she. But actually, it's better to use you anyway because it's more personal and affecting. You can check your language on tools like Gender Decoder. This was actually designed for job adverts. There's lots of subtle language in job adverts that can mean some jobs appeal more to men over women. But you can use this tool to check any kind of content to see if you're accidentally not including people in what you're writing. It is still okay to call out specific groups. Some marginalised groups have historically and continue to be excluded from certain spaces, and they might expect to keep being so unless you call it out. So make sure it's clear that they're welcome. Content Design London uses the example of proactively inviting dads to parenting groups, or letting trans women know that they can apply for a women's work programme. Remember the foreign language effect. I say remember, I only discovered this a few weeks ago, but people react differently to information when it's in their native language or their second or third or fourth language. So research has shown that in their native language, reactions can be more emotive and more instinctual, and in a second language, they can be much more logical and rational. So you might, depending on the kinds of decisions that you want your users to make, you might want to think about translation. Again, when I worked at Women's Aid, we translated a handbook that we had for women who were in abusive relationships. I think we translated it into 20 languages, and it was just a PDF on a website, so not very good practice there, but we did find that we got a lot of feedback saying that the women felt more supported when this pack had been translated into their own language. think about neurodivergent folk. Handily, lots of these tips are also just basic good content design practice. So this might be the quickest content design lesson you're ever going to have. But putting the most important things first, get to the point quickly so people don't get distracted going further down the page. Using clear and concise language, getting to the point quickly, again, means minds won't wander, they won't drift off. Using plain English, some neurodivergent folk struggle with idioms, metaphors, things like that. Clear instructions and steps. In a work setting, for example, giving people clear deadlines, noting how urgent a task is can really help people out. Reminders within services and repeating acronym meanings. I feel like we were taught at school not to do that, but actually it's okay because you can't expect your users, any user, to remember what you've told them previously, and particularly for neurodivergent folk or people who might be more forgetful, that could be really useful. Avoid visual distractions. I think we probably all know this. We remember all the websites from the early 2000s where it was like blah, 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 blah. It's really hard for then people to do what they need to on a page. So generally, making it as easy as possible for people to do what they need to do with as few distractions as possible is the best way to go. Etty Bailey-King has a really good article about this, in particular how to support neurodivergent colleagues in writing, and I really recommend signing up to her Substack. It's called Fighting Talk. This is my favourite one that I feel like David Schitt really demonstrates well. Only ask for information that you absolutely need. So if you're designing forms or you're information gathering in any sort of way, ask yourself why you're asking for this. Why did that cinema, for example, need to know my gender? I did email them to ask, but unsurprisingly, they did not get back to me. But I'm going to assume it's for marketing purposes. But obviously, a much better question would have been, what kind of movies do I enjoy? So don't include questions about personal information unless you have a really good evidence-based reason to do so. And if you really need the information, make sure your answers don't other people. Best practice is to list options in alphabetical or numerical order. It's best to use free text boxes if you can. That can be tricky for some data capture reasons, but if you can do it, do. And include all the options and an option not to answer. You might need to research what all the options are because they change, they're not static. So really research that when you can. And it's also great if you can include preferred or chosen name, a space to phonetically pronounce names, if that's something you're going to need later on, and pronoun boxes as well. Hopefully this will work. Yeah, it's vital to think about what you might be missing, and it obviously wouldn't be a content design talk in 2024 if I didn't mention ChatGPT. So as an experiment, I asked it a question, which was, where can I get outside in Bristol? This one I did on my phone. I did another one on my laptop that actually gave a much longer answer, but neither of them mentioned the accessibility of any of these places. So if I was a disabled person, the answer wouldn't really help me that much. And the laptop answer was much longer and mostly included a list of very fun activities, walking, cycling, caving, climbing, but all things that I might not be able to do if I was disabled, pregnant, or an older person. So no shade to ChatGPT, obviously, but as well as compiling our collective knowledge, also compiles our collective biases, and there's quite a lot of research at the moment to suggest that some of those biases are racial. So it can be a really helpful tool if you're really stuck for words, but you're going to have to be careful and think about what's missing. Limit using euphemisms, idioms, and metaphors. They can be tricky and confusing for users. Examples are things like going the extra mile or running a little behind. A neurodiverse person, for example, might get the gist, but they might be confused or anxious about the specifics of those. And we have some absolutely baffling idioms in the UK, and I did research quite a lot for this talk, but a few are blow your socks off, bless your little cotton socks, put a sock in it, and pull your socks up. So we just sound like a nation obsessed with socks. And most of them are harmless, and we can often slip into them when we feel uncomfortable about the subject matter or the true meaning, for example, talking about death. But by attempting to conceal it, we can lose meaning as well. They also add lots of unnecessary words and can make copy longer, which is, as a content designer, something we're always fighting against. But confusingly, if your users use them, then mirror them. There are some difficult topics like death or grief where users might find euphemisms comforting. And while some organisations like Compassion for Dying say not to use them, there definitely are people who would find that comforting. So there's no hard and fast rules, unfortunately, I'm sorry, because we're all different. And as much as we'd like to segment for consistency, it's okay to break best practice if your users are telling you that's the case. And this lesson applies to more than just euphemisms. We should listen to users, mirror their language, and let them define how they want to be spoken to. But unless you're researching them, you won't know. So I'm just going to sum up with a few inclusive rules to live by. Right, with, not for, is the first one. Involve your users as much as you can. Don't make any assumptions about what they want or what they need. Give people choices, let them define how they want to be spoken about. My favourite, don't ask for unnecessary information. And it's okay to get it wrong. It's cheesy, but it is a journey. We're all going to make mistakes, so as long as you can set it right if you can and move on and learn from it, you're going to be okay. I do have some resources at the end here, but I'm going to assume that Henry is going to make their way to you after this talk. So thank you very much.